Good evening, guys. As you all know, in the previous session, we could only finish half of the most important topics under the law of contract. And today's session, my effort is going to be to wind up the remaining important concepts related to the law of contract. And thereafter, I'm going to pick up with the most important topics and subtopics under the law of contract. So let's begin our session. Last time we were supposed to discuss the various elements which tend to interfere with the person's free consent and how a lack of free consent can render a contract voidable. So let us start this session by understanding exactly what are those factors which tend to interfere with a person's free consent. See, when we discussed the essential elements of a valid contract in the very beginning, free consent was one of the most outstanding features because every contract or agreement is ultimately based on offer or acceptance, and whether you're making an offer or you're accepting an offer, the most important thing is that you do it out of your own free will or your own free choice. You should not be under any kind of pressure or influence or a wrong impression when you make your offer or acceptance, because ultimately offer and acceptance both are based on the idea of consensus ad idem, that is meeting of minds, which basically means that the two parties who enter into a contract should be agreeing upon the same thing in the same manner. But if either of the parties is not agreeing to the same thing in the same manner out of his or her free will, then we cannot expect to conclude a valid contract. If you take a look at the slide, the following five factors interfere with an individual's free consent. You can see coercion, undue influence, fraud, misrepresentation and mistake. Let me explain something to you at the very onset. In our previous lecture, I had explained to you what is a voidable contract and what's a void contract. So on this very slide, I want to give you clarity that the first four elements, that is coercion, undue influence, fraud and misrepresentation, will render your contract voidable. As far as the last element is concerned, it will render your contract void. Moving on to the first element which interferes with an individual's free consent, coercion. Now coercion basically means that in order to make someone either make a certain offer or accept a certain offer, another person threatens that individual by either committing an act which is forbidden under the IPC or simply by threatening that he or she might commit an act which is forbidden under the IPC. IPC, as we discussed in our first lecture, is the Indian Penal Code, and it defines what acts are a crime in India and what is going to be the consequent punishment for those crimes. Also, another way of coercing, pressurizing or forcing a party into making an offer or an acceptance is when you detain another individual's property or again you threaten to do it. So something you have to remember is that in both the situations you either threaten to do an act which is forbidden under the IPC or you actually do it, and similarly you either threaten to detain somebody's property or you actually do it. If you look at the illustration on the slide, it says P unlawfully detains R, A's best friend, and thereby obtains A's consent to a certain contract. So this detention of R could come under the category of kidnapping, abduction or wrongful confinement, and all these three acts are specifically forbidden under the IPC, which means they are offences in India. Moving on, undue influence. If you look at the very word, undue means unfair and influence is to have an impact on another. Now, as far as the Indian contract is concerned, the law is mindful of the fact that sometimes a certain offer is made to you by a certain person or you're bound to accept certain offers because the person or the party that is making a certain offer has such a position in your life, it could be professionally or personally, that you may find it extremely difficult to decline a certain offer or to refuse from accepting a certain offer. Now, in this case, if you look at the essentials of undue influence, when one of the parties is in a position to dominate. So a keyword on this slide is dominate. The party which is either making the offer or the party which is supposed to accept your offer has a position of dominance in your life. Like I've mentioned, the dominance could be professional or it could also be personal. So if you find it hard to say no for a particular offer to your boss or to your teacher, and in your personal lives you may find it hard to decline a certain offer that is given to you by a relative. So in these situations, these people dominate your will or they dominate your free consent, and you may end up saying yes or no to an offer, or you may end up accepting an offer or making an offer that ideally you did not want to in the first place. And the person who is making such an undue offer, or the person who expects you to accept a certain offer, is very aware of this position of dominance that he has in your life, and he takes unfair advantage of that. If you look at this case that I've quoted on the slide, it says Manu Singh versus Umadat Pandey, and what happened here is a spiritual advisor had told his disciple that if the latter transfers all the property in his name, he will attain mukti. So here in this situation, the spiritual advisor, who happens to have a dominant position in the life of the disciple, used his position of dominance to basically strike an unfair deal and make sure that the disciple transferred his entire property to the guru. Moving on. The third element that has the ability to interfere with your free consent is that of fraud. Now the very fraud brings a couple of words to your minds, that is cheating, deceit, or in very simple terms, a word in Hindi which is very commonly associated with the word fraud is dhoka dena. Now ultimately fraud definitely has that element of deceit or cheat, and it has another inherent element, that is of a malified intention or a bad or wrongful intention. What is that intention? The intention is to project certain things in such a way so as to ensure that the other party enters into a contract. It either makes a certain offer or accepts a certain offer. Had the fraudulent person not projected things in a certain manner, you would have not either made the offer or accepted the offer. Let's take a look at the slide. Fraud means the commission of an act by a party to a contract. Now the intent is, that is the intention is to deceive. That is why I'm using the word malified. And the deception is meant for the other party, and ultimately what is it that you are aiming to attain through this deception? You want to induce the other party to enter into a certain contract. Now what does fraud really include? We are going to try to study fraud from different aspects and different angles, and we'll see exactly which situations fall under the category of fraud. Let's see the first category, suggesting a false act. When I say suggesting a false act, it means that you are suggesting a false aspect or a false fact to another party, and you're very well aware that you're not speaking the truth. So ultimately again the intention to deceive is really strong in this situation as well. So an illustration that I've quoted in the bracket is to falsely suggest that a chain is made of gold when it is actually not made of gold. So if a customer visits a shop and the shopkeeper tells the customer that a certain chain has been made out of gold, when he is very well aware that the chain is made out of some other metal and it simply looks like gold, then it's going to amount to fraud, because here the shopkeeper is suggesting a false fact even though he is completely aware himself that ultimately the intention is to deceive. Then the second aspect related to fraud is actively concealing a fact. Okay, sometimes if all the facts were thrown out in the open, then there is definitely a scope for the other party to make a different decision. So sometimes you have to actively conceal facts because they have the power or they have the ability or they are big enough to make sure that the party changes his or her mind. If you look at the illustration that I've quoted in the bracket, concealing a crack on a piece of furniture. Now, if a piece of furniture is cracked and the shopkeeper does not conceal it, ideally the customer will not buy it for the fixed price, or the customer will not buy it at all. So the customer is either looking at a situation where he gets to buy that piece of furniture for a lower price than quoted, or will make a different choice altogether. So in this case, when the shopkeeper is concealing that crack, he is interfering with the judgment of the customer. So ultimately he is deceiving the customer. He's making sure that the customer never finds out that there's a crack on the piece of furniture, and the customer ends up buying that piece of furniture. Moving ahead, Shraddha, caveat emptor applies in the second point, that's for sure, but the word that I've used here is active concealment. See, caveat emptor means let the buyer beware. So it means that there is an equal responsibility on the buyer or the customer also when he goes to a shop and he buys a product. Okay, that's definitely there. But what is the maximum you can do? If you look at a piece of furniture, you can take and you can broadly take a look at the piece of furniture, but if there is a latent defect, if there is a crack and it has been actively concealed, there is no way you're going to be able to find out at that very moment where you're making your choice whether a crack is there or not. So as an aware customer, your duty is to take a very thorough look at that piece of furniture and make sure you don't get a bad deal for yourself. But if a defect has been concealed or hidden actively, caveat emptor will not apply in this situation. Clear? Alright, moving ahead, let's study fraud from a few more aspects. Promise made without an intention of performing it. So sometimes you promise certain things, and at that moment when you're making those promises, you're very well aware that means you have that malified intention that you're not going to fulfill the promise. You are making that promise just for the moment to ensure that the other party falls for your promise or believes your promise, and thereafter either makes an offer or makes an acceptance. Now, if you look at the illustration that I've quoted in the bracket, a man purchased some goods on credit with the intention of not repaying. So when you go to a shopkeeper and you tell the shopkeeper that you don't have any money on you right now, but you're going to come by later and you're going to repay the person. Now, there can be two situations. In one situation, you have a bona fide intention. That means you have a clear intention that you're actually going to come by at a later time and pay the person the money that is due to him. The other situation is that you are just making that promise of paying the shopkeeper later on just for the sake of ensuring that the shopkeeper gives you goods at that moment. So this is a situation where the person who's buying those goods on credit is acting fraudulently. Then the next point here is any act which the law specifically declares fraudulent. Now, there are certain laws which specify very clearly as to what acts are going to amount to a fraudulent act. Now, in the bracket, I've quoted Transfer of Property Act, and Transfer of Property Act is a species of Indian Contract Act because it deals with contracts related to the buying and selling or dealing with in any which way with immovable property. So the Transfer of Property Act is very clear that if a seller fails to reveal to the buyer any material defect of which he is aware. Okay, so say for example, there are two parties. One of the parties involved in the selling of a house, and the other party is an interested or prospective customer. So when the customer goes in to inspect the house that he might buy, the seller at that time is completely aware that this house has a defective or faulty electric wiring. Now this is something he is completely aware of. So as per the Transfer of Property Act, if this aspect of having a faulty wiring is extremely material to the customer who is planning to buy the house. Okay, water, electricity are some basic necessities when an individual decides to stay in a house. Correct? So if at that time the seller does not reveal to his customer that you might have to change the entire wiring of the house when you move in, then this is going to amount to a fraudulent act. Another important aspect here is mere silence is no fraud. So ideally they are saying that if you're silent about a particular thing, it's not going to be fraud. But we're also talking about an exception here. We're talking about relationships of trust and confidence. Now, as a general rule, what happens is if you go to a particular party to enter into a contract of any sorts, say for example, you're planning to buy a house for yourself. Now, if you go to a party who you're not familiar with at all, your only association with that person is that of a customer and a property dealer, very uninhibitedly you're going to ask 100 questions about the quality of that property, the status of that property, and you are going to make sure to your heart's content that you have absolute clarity about the status of the property. But what about those situations when there is a relationship of trust and confidence between parties? So if there's someone at a personal level, say for example it's a very close relative of yours who's planning to sell his house to you, so then there happens to be this inherent trust or confidence, so to speak, that you are not going to cut out a bad deal. Okay, so your relative is not going to offer you a bad deal, absolutely. So you are going to ask lesser questions. So in this situation, if the relative, that is any party you have a relationship of trust and confidence with, does not disclose certain defects, latent or superficial to you, about the subject matter of the contract, then it is going to be a fraudulent transaction. Alright, the next element which might interfere with free consent is misrepresentation. What I want to know from your end is if you have any query. Alright, I'll just move ahead. I'm going to talk about misrepresentation now. Now, misrepresentation and fraud are very similar, so to speak, because in both the situations, fraud, we've already studied that the person is making a statement which is false, and he knows he's making a false statement, but he has a malified intention to basically deceive the other party. On the other hand, as far as misrepresentation is concerned, the question is, the main point of difference is that in misrepresentation, the intention is bona fide, and in fraud the intention is malified. So what I'd like to say about misrepresentation is that basically when you're making a statement under misrepresentation, you know that you are making an honest statement from your end. You don't know about the fact that the statement you're making is actually a dishonest statement. If you look at the illustration that I've quoted on this slide, A sells a camera to B, genuinely believing it to be made in America. However, it turns out to have been manufactured in China. Now, in this case, when A is selling a camera to B, he is under a genuine impression that the camera has been manufactured in America. So when he is trying to sell it to a customer and saying that the camera has been manufactured in America, he is making a misrepresentation. Had he known that the camera has been manufactured in China, but just to make sure that the customer buys the camera, he tries to deceive the customer by saying that the camera has actually been manufactured in America. So here this is a case of fraud, because in one situation he was under the genuine faith or belief that what he's speaking is correct, and under fraud he knows that he's making an incorrect statement just to make sure that the customer buys the camera from him. Now in this case, the buyer will get the right to cancel the contract as B's consent has been affected by misrepresentation. Now we come down to the final element which tends to interfere with an individual's free consent, that is mistake. Alright, I've already clarified in the beginning of the session that whenever a contract involves an element of free consent which is affected by mistake, then the contract is always going to be void. Okay, the previous four elements that we've discussed, that is coercion, undue influence, fraud, misrepresentation, they render a contract voidable. However, mistake will render your contract void. Alright, one thing is really important, that there are two types of mistakes that can be made when we study law. So law talks about either mistake of fact or law talks about mistake of law. Now there's a very important maxim which will make things clearer for us. There's this maxim which says ignorantia juris non excusat, which means ignorance of law is not an excuse, and on the other hand the other part of the maxim says ignorantia facit excusat, which means ignorance of fact is an excuse but ignorance of law cannot be accepted as an excuse. Now the very reason why this maxim has been created is, and why it is followed by most of the legal justice systems around the world, is because otherwise every person is going to violate the law and ultimately he is going to plead that he was mistaken about the law or he was not aware about the law. So that is a mistake of law cannot be allowed to be pleaded as a defense. On the other hand, as far as Indian Contract Act is concerned, there are definitely certain facts that you can be mistaken about. Well, the first type of fact that a party may be mistaken about is the mistake of identity. Let's read about it. When one party represents himself to be someone else, or the other situation is one party confuses a party for some other party. Now Bolton versus Jones, the case I've quoted on the slide, is a perfect example of it, that sometimes you may be under an impression that you are basically entering into a contract with party A, but under a mistake you end up entering into a contract with party B. Then in this case your consent will not be considered to be free, because your consent is to enter into a contract with A and not B. Let's take a look at this, the facts of this case. Jones sent an order to Brocklehurst for the purchase of certain goods. By the time the order reached, Brocklehurst had sold his business to Bolton. Now let me simplify this for you. So basically we have three parties over here. We have a businessman, alright, also we have his manager, and then we have a customer. Now the customer used to usually send all his orders to the businessman on his name. Now one day the businessman sold his business to the manager and the customer was unaware of this fact. So the customer kept sending in his orders. Now the customer, as a matter of routine, sent another order to the businessman, and the manager decided to fulfill the contract and he dispatched the goods that had been ordered by the customer. When the manager demanded the customer to make the payment, the customer said that I made an offer to the businessman, the original owner of the business. So this cannot amount to a contract because the offer was meant for the businessman, since the order was sent on his name. So the manager cannot accept on his behalf. So this is a case of mistake regarding identity of parties, and that is why a valid contract cannot be established. Alright, what is the second type of mistake, or what is the second type of fact that a party may be mistaken about as per the Indian Contract Act? Mistake as to the subject matter. Now sometimes the circumstances may be such that you may end up making a mistake about the subject matter of a contract. Subject matter means the actual purpose for which you are entering into a contract. If you are involved in the buying and selling of oil, oil happens to be the subject matter. If an employer hires an employee, then his exact work scope, salary, working hours are going to constitute subject matter. So if you look at this illustration, the sale of a horse which unknown to the parties was dead. Now in this case, when you're talking about the buying or sale of a horse, the horse happens to be the subject matter. So when two parties are entering into a contract regarding the buying or selling of a horse, and none of them are aware that the horse was dead at the time, so it means that it is going to be a mistake regarding the subject matter, because even if the court wants to enforce this contract, they will not be able to, because the contract was regarding the sale of a specific horse, and since the horse is dead, so ultimately it will render the contract void. Jobin, your question is, can customer return the goods to the manager? Of course, ultimately if he is not paying for the goods, he will have to return the goods to the manager. But the point I am trying to clarify is that, is it even a valid agreement in the first place, because the offer was made to the original businessman and not to the manager. Shraddha says, was Jones supposed to give the goods which were supplied to him? See, if we go back to the, so I've answered that through Jobin's question, that he is supposed to, ideally that is what equity demands, that he should be returning the goods to the manager if he is not paying for them. Clear? Okay. The third type of mistake that can be made is regarding the nature of promise. Okay. So if you look at the illustration, gift deed, that is signed under the impression that it is only a power of attorney. Clear? So in this case, you might think that you're actually buying a house and you're going to get the ownership of the house, right? And the seller is only going to lease out the house for you. So you end up signing the lease papers under the impression that it is ownership. So these days we have a popular trend that property is usually leased out for a very long time. It could be 99 years, it could be 66 years, it could be 200 years, but you will still never be called the owner of the property. You will continue to remain the lessee of that property. So in this case, you might be mistaken about what is the nature of your promise. Are you promising to each other to exchange the ownership of property, or the promise is to just lease out the property? Because lease is known as 9 out of 10 ownership. That means that it is as good as ownership, but still that one point is missing, right? So you can be mistaken about three things. You can be mistaken about the identity of parties, you can be mistaken about the subject matter, and ultimately you can be mistaken about the nature of promise. Power of attorney, Shraddha, is when you give somebody the power to take certain actions on your behalf legally. Okay, so we usually say that the power of attorney has been transferred to so and so. So then that person becomes authorized to carry out certain assigned functions on your behalf. Okay, so I am done with the elements which usually interfere with free consent. Is there any query? Also, please feel free to throw in any questions that you've been taking in mocks that you're doubtful of. Alright, I'm going to proceed to the next segment, and my next segment talks about quasi-contract. Till now we've been talking about contracts which have been entered by into parties either expressly or impliedly in the written or an oral form. Now we are going to talk about quasi-contract. If you look at the first point on the slide, these are contracts which are implied in law, which are constructive, or which are deemed in law. Anjani, can you clarify your question a little bit? Okay, I'm going to wait for you to give me some more clarity on your question. As far as quasi-contracts are concerned, so these are not express contracts. That means parties have not entered into a contract either in a written form or in an oral form. So if you look at the second point, contract, so we've simplified it through an equation: any agreement that is offer plus acceptance which has the additional element of legal obligation. So I've clarified all these aspects in my last lecture. Also, quasi-contract, now we're talking about the quasi-contract. The only difference, or the very big difference between a contract and quasi-contract is there is simply a legal obligation or a legal duty. Okay, there is no agreement between the parties. Now your question, I'm sure, is when two parties have not entered into an agreement with each other, which means that neither one of them have made an offer nor has the other party made an acceptance, then how can we create legal obligation? Okay, this legal obligation is based on the doctrine of unjust enrichment, which means that if you end up benefiting unjustly at the cost or expense of another person, or you profit at the cost of another person, or you end up using something which was due for another person, then it is your duty to reimburse or pay back that person. Now ideally you cannot enter into a contract with every human being on this earth, okay, but there are chances that due to some mistake, due to some confusion, something that was meant to you was used by another party. Say for example, you order a phone online and you've paid for it beforehand, it by mistake gets delivered to your neighbor. Now in this case, the neighbor clearly knows that he never placed an offer, right, and he's not supposed to be using that phone, but ultimately he starts using that phone. The minute you are going to realize that it's your neighbor who's been using the phone that you had ordered and you had paid for, now isn't it a case of unjust enrichment? He has profited at your cost. Now the point is, you are entitled to your phone that you had ordered. Also you may claim damages, because once he has opened the box and the phone becomes a used phone or a second hand phone, so there is a depreciation in its value. Clear? Yes, Anjani, in nature by promise. Anjani, can you quote a specific example for me? Because I would not say that the question is not clear, but it will really help if you could quote a certain example for me, or exactly what aspect are you confused about. Moving ahead, now I'll be discussing certain instances of quasi-contract with you. Now the first instance is when necessaries are supplied to a person who is not capable of contracting on his account. It means that sometimes, see, we know that a minor, a person who's below 18, cannot enter into a contract on his own. Now if you keep supplying him the basic necessities of life, food, clothing, shelter, education, medicines, traveling allowance, these are the basic necessities that everyone requires as far as a meaningful existence is concerned. So if you keep supplying a person who is below 18 years of age throughout his minority necessities, okay, the necessities that I've just quoted or mentioned, then once he attains majority, but keep in mind only if he has certain property in his name, okay, so after attaining majority and if he has some kind of property in his name, then he's supposed to reimburse. That means he's supposed to pay back the person who paid for these necessities from that property. In case he has no property to his name, then he's not supposed to reimburse, because he has no way or resource for reimbursing the person who paid for his necessities. Okay, then A supplies to B, a mentally challenged person. Now I'm trying to give an example to you about another instance. I've just discussed minority with you. Now I'm going to talk about another kind of individual who's not capable of entering into a contract, somebody who's mentally challenged. Now somebody who's mentally challenged or is insane or has an unsound mind cannot enter into a contract, because again we cannot apply consensus ad idem to him. He's not capable of understanding the terms and conditions of his contract. So if a mentally challenged person is supplied with necessaries, then A should be reimbursed from B's property. Reimbursed is if you pay a certain money, then you are entitled to get that money again. Now reimbursement is very popularly used as far as reimbursement of medical bills is concerned for government employees. So if a government employee spends any kind of money, any amount of money in buying medicines, okay, or on getting any kind of medical treatment, then ultimately the employee is reimbursed by the government. That means the government will pay that government employee the exact same amount of money that he has spent on either the medicines or his treatment. Yeah, Shraddha is right. She has quoted the exact meaning for you. Alright. Then reimbursement of persons paying money due to other in payment of which he is interested. So please don't get confused because of the way this is worded. You need to understand that sometimes you might end up fulfilling somebody else's financial responsibility. Now, say for example, you live in a house, okay, and you further kept a tenant in the house, just like the illustration that I've quoted, that you're living in a certain house and you further kept a tenant. Now the landlord asks you for certain money. By certain money I mean he asks you for the rent that is due to him. Say for example, you've not paid your rent for the last 3 months. So now the subtenant, that means you're a tenant yourself and you further kept a tenant. So if you don't get to stay in the house, the subtenant will also not get to stay in the house. So say for example, the subtenant ends up paying the entire amount of money to the landlord. So in this case, the tenant profits from the situation. Now it is his duty to ultimately pay the subtenant because he ended up making the payment on behalf of the tenant. Moving on, quasi-contract, again we are discussing it further. A person enjoying a benefit of a non-gratuitous act. Now a gratuitous act usually is an act of grace, but what we are talking about over here is a non-gratuitous act. So as long as you're doing an act of grace, you want somebody to benefit or you want somebody to profit from a service or a good, then that's fine. But if somebody is trying to take unfair advantage or profit or benefit from an act of yours which is not meant to be an act of grace, then that person has to again reimburse you. Let's take a look at the illustration. A shopkeeper delivers a basket containing fruits to B, and this happens by mistake. B consumes the fruit. Now the shopkeeper is not doing charity, okay, as the illustration tells us. It's not his intention to give another individual a basket of fruits for free. He has by mistake delivered the fruits to B and they were not meant for B. So when B consumes those fruits, he is supposed to reimburse the shopkeeper. Clear? Then another situation is when you find any kind of movable good, it is your first duty to try and look for the person to whom the goods might belong to. And again, if something is paid to you or given to you or delivered to you by mistake, it is your duty, primary duty, to return it to the person to whom that good or service is meant. Alright, so I am done with the most important concepts related to law of contract. So if you have any query whatsoever related to the law of contract, please feel free to throw in your queries, because after this I am going to pick up a completely new subject, that is law of torts. So act of necessities. Jobanpreet, necessities are your basic requirements of life, okay, like food, clothing, shelter, education, medical expenses, traveling allowances. By I'm just assuming that you want to understand what is necessities. Also, if somebody has been paying for those necessities of yours, okay, there can be two situations. Ideally, a person may be unfit physically or mentally, or he may be a person who's a minor, that is, he's below 18. So in all these three situations, say for example, if there's a minor, if he is supposed to inherit certain property, he will not be able to inherit it or become its actual owner till he turns 18, right? In the other situation where the person is physically or mentally unfit, he is not in a position to deal with his property. Now, when somebody keeps paying for your necessities, basic needs of life, then this person who is a minor, the minute he turns 18, and if there is any property in his name, from that property he is supposed to pay back that person for all the necessities that he has supplied. Similarly, anybody who is responsible for the property of the person who is physically or mentally unwell has to reimburse the person who has supplied for their necessities. Any other questions? Jobanpreet, you're discussing IPC with me. Offense under necessity. I'm going to quickly repeat it for you, even though this session is specifically restricted to law of contract and torts. Necessity means that sometimes the situation is such, okay, that you have to do certain acts. An act done under necessity would mean that, say for example, there is a row of huts, it catches fire, alright, and you know that if you don't pull down a few huts, the fire is going to become bigger and it is going to engulf the entire colony. So here the necessity is, or the situation demands that you break the chain. So in this situation you actually pull down a few huts to break the chain of fire. So you have acted under a situation where you were trying to save a bigger harm or a bigger loss. Now in this case you are going to get a complete defense, because all the defenses we studied from accident to private defense, I told you they're complete defenses. If you're able to prove a lack of criminal intention, then you can escape punishment 100%. Anjani, by nature of promise, I mean that sometimes you might feel that you are applying for the job of a manager, and ultimately when the offer letter is handed out to you, the designation says junior manager, and you end up signing the employment contract. Now here one party feels that the job is that of a manager and the other party feels that it is of a junior manager. So here your nature of promise is different. Or another example could be that you might feel that you are being hired as a full-time employee, however the employer is hiring you as a part-time employee. So your status as an employee is getting affected. Again, the two parties are mistaken about the nature of promise. Promise means exactly what is it that the two parties expect from each other. Okay. Any other queries related to law of contract, please? In case you have a question even related to IPC, you're more than welcome. Alright, so now I'm going to simply proceed with law of torts. And in case there's any query, there's any question, please feel free to throw in your queries while I'm taking the session with you. So students, I'm going to start with the next subject, law of torts. And again, I've mentioned it time and again that three subjects have a lot of relevance for any law entrance, that is IPC, contract and law of torts, because the maximum number of principal fact questions are going to be asked from the following three subjects that I've just mentioned to you. Another specific reason for why I'm immediately taking up law of torts after law of contract is because there is a glaring difference between the two. You will definitely get a better clarity regarding law of torts if you have finished studying or understanding law of contract. Anjani, the difference between actus reus and mens rea is actus reus is a physical act and mens rea is the mental element. So usually we follow this maxim, actus non facit rum nisi mensit rea, which means in order to make an act punishable, the physical act alone is not enough. It should also be accompanied by a guilty mind. So mens rea is the guilty mind, that is the mental element, and actus reus is the physical act or the physical element, something that can be seen. So you have to prove two things to make a person punishable, actus reus plus mens rea. Alright? Okay, let us begin by understanding what is a tort, okay, because the title says law of torts. So let us look at the definition and characteristics. Tort basically comes from the word tortum, which means twisted. Now, conducts which are not straight or lawful, okay, or we've written equivalent to the term wrong. Now, ideally, the moment an individual's legal right gets violated, okay, then the person who is violating this right, he is called the tortfeasor. Okay, the person who commits a tort is a tortfeasor. Another thing you need to understand is that tortfeasors is basically the violator. Okay, in this case, which means somebody who has violated the legal right vested in another individual. That person is the tortfeasor, and in case two or more people jointly violate the legal right of another individual, then that aspect is known as a joint tortfeasor. So what we are going to understand under law of torts is that how can you make another person liable who you don't know at all, also you've not entered into any kind of a contract with him. Okay, so we are going to understand that in such a situation, when a person who's neither familiar to you nor has entered into a contract with you and he ends up violating your legal right, how are you going to make that person liable? This is exactly where the scope of law of torts begins. Now, how does a tort occur? If you take a look at the slide, there has to definitely be an act or an omission. Act is when you positively do something, you do an act. Omission is when you fail to do something or you do not do something that you're meant to do. Now, this act or omission by one individual amounts to a violation of right, a right which vests in another individual. So, breach of legal duty is there, but the breach should not be a breach of contract. Now, I told you a couple of minutes ago that the main difference between law of contract and law of torts is that there is a liability in both the cases between two parties, but in one situation there is an agreement, of course that is there under contract, but under torts there is no agreement between the two parties. So the only thing you have to prove is, if again we go back to the first point, there has to be an act or omission. That act or omission should lead to the violation of a legal right that vests in another individual. So we are talking about civil liability outside the scope of breach of contract. Before I move on to the maxims, I'm going to quote a case for you and we'll discuss that case and we'll understand how sometimes in life you have to deal with situations where you are not under a contractual obligation but you can still make the other party liable to you. So there's this very important and famous case which is known as the hot coffee case. So this was a case which was filed by an old lady, Mrs. Liebeck, against the McDonald's Restaurants Limited. So we're all aware that McDonald's is a name which is popular worldwide as far as fast food chains are concerned. In this case, what happened is she ordered a hot coffee from McDonald's and she did not actually sit inside McDonald's and have the coffee, but she asked the waiter to give her the coffee in a takeaway glass or a disposable glass for her to carry it back with her. Now, as soon as she sat in the car, so she placed the coffee cup, the takeaway cup, in between her thighs. Now, when she was taking off the lid of that jar, the coffee spilled out, and since the coffee was hot, it burnt the skin on her thighs, and since she was an old lady, it took a lot of time for her to recover. Now, ideally, if you look at it from the perspective of law of contract, you will say that once the customer pays for the coffee and once the coffee chain gives a hot cup of coffee, contract is fulfilled. Consideration has been taken care of. There is value addition on both the sides. Now, yes, Hina, it is Mrs. Liebeck versus McDonald's Restaurants Limited. Okay, it's popularly known as the hot coffee case. Now, this woman, Mrs. Liebeck, she filed a case against McDonald's and she wanted McDonald's to pay for the injuries or the burns that she had suffered. So, in this case, McDonald's took up the plea that once they have given the old lady her coffee after accepting money from her, the contract has been fulfilled. They cannot take liability for the woman if she cannot handle her cup of coffee and she ends up spilling coffee on her thighs. Now, the most interesting observation that was made by the court in this situation was, they said that this coffee was dangerously hot. Okay, so the observation that the court made was that ideally when coffee is served to you, it should be only hot enough to take a sip without burning your tongue. But apparently the coffee had been served at 80 degrees Celsius, and we know the boiling point is 100 degrees Celsius. So it was enough to cause some serious burns on the skin of anybody who the coffee fell on. So in this case, a very heavy compensation was awarded to Mrs. Liebeck, which is of to the tune of 2.86 million dollars. So this is a situation. McDonald's does not enter into a contract with its customers and says that okay, if you end up spilling coffee on yourself, or if you end up burning your tongue or your skin because of our food products, we are going to compensate you. So this is what makes law of torts very special. Also, another thing is that if you want to see how developed a nation's judicial system is, you must look at how advanced the law of torts are. One more thing is that law of torts is not a law in the true sense of the word. It is not an act like the IPC of 1860 or the Indian Contract Act of 1872 or the Constitution of India of 1950. Yes, Hina, I'm coming to your question. Law of torts is basically a collection of principles. And who has evolved these principles? The various courts in Europe, and to be very specific, let me name two countries, America and Britain. The courts of these two countries, through various judgments, have evolved several legal principles, and these legal principles have been adopted throughout the world. So India definitely gives recognition to the concept of torts. When I say that India gives recognition to the concept of torts, I mean that India recognizes that there can be a liability or there can be a responsibility even in a situation where there is no contract between two parties. So in India, it is section, please take note, section 2M of the Limitation Act, where the law of tort has been defined. So this is a passive way of showing acceptance for the various principles that have been devised under law of torts. Am I clear, Hina? So law of torts has been accepted at different levels as far as India is concerned. If you see defamation, it's a tort. Under IPC, it's a offense in India. Or if you see assault and criminal force, we have similar concept under torts under the name of assault and battery. Clear? The purpose of law of torts is basically to put an individual back in the position in which he or she was before the tort took place. Okay, so how do you do it? The term that we use is unliquidated damages. As far as torts and contract both are concerned, see, there is never any imprisonment, okay, because these are civil laws. So the only way in which you can get compensated is through money. In contract, because the terms and conditions are clear from the very beginning and you know what are the do's and don'ts you have to keep in mind. And say for example, if you enter into a contract with someone that you're going to supply me 10 kgs of rice every month. So in case the person does not supply 10 kgs of rice to you, the amount of loss you've suffered can be determined very easily. So in the very terms and conditions of the contract, it can be written from beforehand that in case you fail to supply the 10 kgs of rice before this date of the month, then you have to pay this amount of money as compensation or damages. But as you've seen, as far as law of torts is concerned, we are talking about situations which are completely unexpected or unprecedented. So when Mrs. Liebeck ends up spilling coffee on her thighs, this is not something that she saw coming. So she cannot enter into a contract with McDonald's beforehand that in case I end up spilling coffee. So there can be innumerable situations. That is why under torts the damages are unliquidated. That means they cannot be predetermined or they cannot be prefixed. Alright. Now, what are the various maxims that we have to keep in mind when we are deciding the liability under law of torts? See, we are throwing up a huge arena for litigants when we say that you don't even have to have a contractual relationship with the other party under law of torts. Then there have to be certain benchmarks or there have to be certain guidelines that one has to consider Okay, when deciding whether the other party has to be made to be paid compensation or not. There are two really important maxims that you must keep in mind. The first one is injuria sine damnum, and the second one is damnum sine injuria. Jobanpreet, the difference between liquidated and unliquidated damage is, liquidated damage means a compensation that you can determine from beforehand. That is why I gave you the example that in case of a contract, the compensation is always liquidated, which means if two parties have entered into a contract, right? Or let me give you another example. Say for example, you organize a star night, okay, and you invite a very popular singer to come and perform at the star night, and you know that you have sold over 5,000 tickets. Okay, so when you sold 5,000 tickets, you know the number of audience that you're expecting, you know the amount of money that you have invested in organizing that star night. So you can very well insert a clause and say that in case the star or the singer does not perform at that night, you can easily calculate your risk from beforehand. Okay, 5,000 tickets are sold, and the infrastructural cost. So from the very beginning in your terms and conditions, you can write that in case the star does not perform, he will have to pay this amount of money to the organizer of the star night. But in case of torts, there has to be a payment of unliquidated damages. Why unliquidated damages? But because under law of torts, there is not a pre-existing contract. Alright, there's no pre-existing contract, and you can't even determine the kind of damages or losses that will take place. So once the situation is over, that's why I told you when I gave you the example of Mrs. Liebeck versus McDonald's. In that case, McDonald's and Mrs. Liebeck both cannot anticipate that she'll end up spilling coffee on her, and she will end up filing a case on McDonald's. So in this case, depending on the degree of burns, her age, the court is going to determine the damages or compensation at a later stage. So damages over here basically mean compensation. Clear? Okay, as far as maxims are concerned, I've told you these are the two maxims that we have to keep in mind when we're deciding whether a person has to pay compensation or not. Now, if you look at these two maxims, injuria sine damnum and damnum sine injuria, so you will say that there's simply an interplay of words over here. When I say injuria, I mean your legal right gets affected with or without any actual loss or damage. I'll repeat this for you. Injuria sine damnum, the maxim basically means that your legal right gets affected. There may or may not be an actual loss or damage. Alright? And damnum sine injuria means you've actually suffered an actual loss or damage, but without any effect on your legal right. Okay? Now I'm going to explain to you how this works. In the case of Ashby versus White, a voter was not allowed to cast his vote for a particular candidate. Alright? And this was done by the returning officer. Returning officer is the person who's in charge of the polling booth. Even though, okay, now what did the returning officer say? He said that the voter's name was not on the voters list. So he denied the voter a right to vote. Later on, it was discovered that his name was there in the voters list, but the person, that is the returning officer, was under some kind of mistake or impression that he did not allow the person to vote. Now he filed a case and he said that I should have been allowed to vote because he has a legal right to vote. Absolutely. Now the other party said that the person he wanted to vote for won the elections anyway. Okay, so he has not really suffered any damage. Okay, because even if he would have voted, the person would have won. Even if he did not vote, the person has still won. So ultimate purpose behind voting is to make sure that the candidate of your choice wins. But in this case, the court applied the maxim that is injuria sine damnum, and they said that his legal right to vote was affected. Whether it might lead to an actual damage or not, that is immaterial. So in this case, the voter was given a compensation. You have to remember the title of this case, Ashby versus White, because you can be asked a direct question that in which case was the principle of injuria sine damnum laid down. Clear? Bhim Singh versus State of Jammu and Kashmir, there's a similar situation where this member of the Vidhan Sabha was not allowed to attend a session and he was detained by the police. So ultimately it turned out that his detention by the police was illegal. So what was affected? His right to movement or his right to personal liberty was affected. So he can basically claim the violation of two rights. One is right to move, that is under Article 19 and Article 19 of the Constitution, and right to personal liberty, Article 21 of the Constitution. So in this case again, he did not really suffer an actual loss, but his legal rights got affected. So he was awarded a compensation of 50,000 rupees. Moving on to the next maxim, damnum sine injuria. So it is the reverse of the situation that I've discussed above with you, that is under injuria sine damnum. Under damnum sine injuria, what happens is there is an actual loss of damage, but your legal right does not get affected. So in the above situations, one thing has become clear to us, that wherever you end up proving that your situation falls under injuria sine damnum, you are going to get compensation. But in the second situation where you're only suffering a loss and your legal right does not get affected, you will not get a compensation. So Gloucester Grammar School case, there was an existing school in a vicinity, and of course all the students would take admission over there. After a couple of years, another school opened up in the vicinity and they were charging lesser fee in comparison to the previous school. So as a result, a lot of students started shifting to the new school. So financially, if you see, the first school suffered a lot of loss, right? But the second case, the legal right was not affected of the owners of the first school, because there is no law in our country which says that if there is one school in a vicinity, there cannot be another school, okay? Because competition is allowed in our country, right? We cannot encourage monopolistic tendencies. So in this case, even though the school owners suffered financial loss, but there was actually no loss to their legal right. So in the first situation, under injuria sine damnum, a person is going to be able to successfully get compensation. But under the second situation, where there is only loss or damage, but there is no effect on the legal right, the person will not get any compensation. Clear? Any queries till now? Alright, I'm going to go ahead. Just like we did a set of defenses under IPC, we are also going to do a set of defenses under torts. Now, the purpose of a defense is that whenever an accusation is made on you, okay, you should be able to plead certain grounds, okay. So in this case, the tortfeasor is going to say that yes, the tort has been committed by him or her, but his tort or his action falls under the following categories. So when you plead such a defense, okay, you are going to be able to escape the responsibility of paying compensation. Clear? Just as you remember, under IPC, what we did was, if a person was trying to claim any defense, that means if he was able to successfully claim that defense, like accident, private defense, act of child, act of an intoxicated or insane person, then he would be able to escape punishment. So the purpose under law of torts is that if a person can successfully claim either of these defenses, he will be able to escape the responsibility of paying compensation. If you take a look at this slide, you'll see voluntary non-fit injuria, plaintiff is the wrongdoer, inevitable accident, act of God, private defense, necessity, and statutory authority. A person may claim that his physical act falls under either of these categories, because in the introduction of law of torts I told you that tort comes from the word tortum, which means twisted or a wrongful act. So if you can claim that your act falls under either of these categories, you'll be able to escape the payment of compensation. Let's understand voluntary non-fit injuria or consent. Now, simply speaking, voluntary non-fit injuria is that situation which says that when you voluntarily undertake a risk, okay, you cannot make anybody else liable for it. Meaning thereby that when you decide to go ahead, with a certain situation and you understand all the inherent risks that may be involved, then you can't make another person responsible for it. Say for example, when you go to watch a cricket match, okay, in the stadium, and you're sitting in the audience stand. Now, if the batsman hits a six, and say for example, the ball hits your head, okay, as a result of the fact that the batsman hit the six. Now, when you are present on the cricket field, it is an incidental risk. Okay, it is not something that is out of the blue. It is something that can be expected. So you can't make the owners of the stadium liable for that injury that you might suffer. However, let's twist the situation a little bit. In case you're walking on the street, okay, and then a ball hits you. Okay, when you're walking on a street, ideally you do not expect to be hit with balls, okay, by a leather ball or any other cricket ball. So on a street we cannot apply voluntary non-fit injuria. However, as far as being in a cricket stadium is concerned, or being in any other sports stadium or a park where a lot of people are playing football or cricket, over there if you suffer any injury from a football or a cricket ball, we can put it under the category of voluntary non-fit injuria. But when you're walking on a road or you are jogging on the joggers lane, and then if a cricket ball hits you or a football hits you, we can't put it under the category of voluntary non-fit injuria. Another thing is, what are the various elements that you must prove when you're trying to take the defense of voluntary non-fit injuria? It talks about voluntary subjection to risk. So whenever you go ahead to do any kind of adventure sport, okay, it can be rafting, it can be bungee jumping, parasailing, paragliding, you basically sign a waiver form. So that waiver form is the most classic or best example of voluntary non-fit injuria. What are you exactly signing up for under that form? You're signing up for the fact that you understand all the risks involved as far as the adventure sport is concerned, and if God forbid something were to happen to you, the organizers of the sport will not be responsible. So if something were to happen to a person who is participating in one of such sports, he cannot make the organizers liable, because the organizers will easily take up the plea of voluntary non-fit injuria. So your consent will serve as a good defense that you knowingly undertook the risk. Consent again can be express or implied. To one who volunteers, no harm is done. So when you yourself place yourself in a position that is risky, you cannot make anybody else liable for the harm you might suffer. What are the most important key requirements? First of all, your consent, which is expressed or implied, has to be voluntary. Secondly, there has to be a sense of agreement with the other party also. That's why I gave you an example of adventure sports. And there has to be a complete knowledge about the kind of danger that you might be subjecting yourselves to. In case a plaintiff means a person who is filing for claim under law of torts. In case the plaintiff was not completely aware about the kind of danger that is involved, the nature and extent of it, then again the tortfeasor, that is the person who is said to have committed the tort, will not be able to successfully take the defense of voluntary non-fit injuria. The next defense that we are going to be discussing is where plaintiff is the wrongdoer himself. I've just explained to you that plaintiff happens to be that individual who files for a claim or who wants to get a compensation from the court for a tort or a wrongful act that has been committed by the other party. Now, if you take a look at the slide, the maxim says ex turpi causa non oritur actio, which means no action can arise from an immoral cause. So plaintiff is the complainant. But if the plaintiff himself is at fault, and if the plaintiff himself committed an act which led to a harm to him or her, then he cannot claim a compensation successfully, because he is at the mistaken end himself. And a very important legal principle is that you must approach the doors of justice with clean hands. If you're at fault at yourself, you can't put the blame on the other party. Now, say for example, if there's a trespasser. To trespass means to be on somebody's property without his consent or without his invitation. Now, say for example, you trespass onto another person's property or land. Okay, say for example, there's an orchard, and the owner of that orchard has say 4 dogs in the orchard, and the dogs basically are there to guard the orchard against trespassers. Now, once you have entered into the orchard with the intention to steal fruits, okay, and if the dogs come and attack you, you will not be able to claim compensation from the owner of that orchard, because you are mistaken. Okay, you entered the property in the first go. Had you not entered the property in the first go, you wouldn't have suffered a harm. Clear? Okay, Purnima, ma'am, what if a person passing through a road, when the vehicles have green light and a car hits him, does it come under voluntary non-fit injuria? Yes, Purnima, because when the cars are coming in his direction and the signal says green, in this case the cars have the right to wait. Now, when the person is completely aware, okay, that the signal is green and it's not his time to be crossing the road, he is voluntarily undertaking the risk. He is also being negligent. Negligent means to be careless, to show disregard for rules and regulations. So it will come under the category of voluntary non-fit to injuria. However, it will also be essential to prove that the driver of the car which ends up hitting the person who was crossing the road, he was the holder of a valid driving license, he was driving within the speed limit with the seat belt on, was not intoxicated, etc., etc. So the other party also again has to come to the court with clean hands. What if we see that kids are playing football but we still keep on walking? See, Hina, this is a scenario that you have to keep in mind. If you see kids are playing, okay, the fact that it's a public street, if you mean, you also have a right to walk on it, but at the same time you cannot stop the kids from playing on the street or in a public area, because you don't have the right to do that. But if a ball hits you, that does not mean you have subjected yourself to that risk. Okay, so the ambience or the environment in which the plaintiff is, that is really important when we are deciding the question of voluntary non-fit injuria. Purnima, what if there is no signal? Then there is another principle we apply, that is of contributory negligence. Okay, now in this case, when there is no signal, it's common sense that the driver as well as the person who's crossing the road both have to be careful. Okay, so in contributory negligence, we'll see that was the driver of the car also negligent when he ended up hitting the person who was crossing the road? We'll see, was the person who was crossing the road also negligent? Did he take enough care and caution? And ultimately, we'll apply the last opportunity rule. When we apply the last opportunity rule, we see that ultimately who was the party who had the opportunity or who had the time to avoid the mishappening. Okay, so we can only solve such questions by applying the contributory negligence rule and last opportunity rule. So depending on the exact facts and circumstances, we'll be able to get the correct answer. Clear? Jobanpreet, as far as PU is concerned, you're supposed to focus on the area of constitution. Okay, because PU is going to give you a mixed set of 100 questions that you have to attempt in 75 minutes, and they ideally ask you questions related to general awareness and current affairs. And when I say current affairs, I'm talking about the most important events that have happened in the year gone by. So if the exam is happening on the 21st of May, so I'm talking about everything that has happened since May 2016. Alright, so the current events, general awareness, again English, and about 20 odd questions from law. And as far as law is concerned, the prime focus remains on constitution. So I would not tell you exactly from where you're supposed to be doing, or a book from where you're supposed to be doing it, but focus on chapters like fundamental rights, then legislature, executive and judiciary, directive principles, emergency. So I cannot give you a clear-cut idea on exactly what they'll be asking, but the previous trend suggests that this is what they focused on so far. So having said that, there can also be fluctuation as far as the exam is concerned. Alright, Hina, I am not exactly the best person to answer as far as maths is concerned, but one thing that I can definitely tell you is that maths is not really stressed upon as far as PU is concerned. So you can take it easy as far as maths is concerned. However, you can definitely write into us, and we have a detailed suggestion of books as far as our website is concerned, and we have enough strategy articles and videos on our website which will tell you not only how to prepare, from where to prepare, and what are the various shortcuts that you can use to answer your questions really quickly. So for maths, you can watch our videos and you can complement them with all the strategy articles. Alright, plaintiff is the wrongdoer is what we were discussing. Again, the act of the plaintiff has to be wrong or immoral, which means that when a person enters into the property of another person without the permission of the owner of that property, his act in itself is wrong and immoral, and ultimately this unlawful conduct has to be connected with the harm suffered. So had the person not entered into the orchard of the other person, or I would not use the word entered, but I would use the word trespassed into the orchard owned by another person, he would have not been attacked. So his unlawful conduct, that is trespassing, is directly connected with the harm that he has suffered. Clear? Inevitable accident. This is the third type of defense that can be taken up. An inevitable accident is an unexpected injury. It was unforeseen and inevitable. The word inevitable means something that is unavoidable. So an accident which happens despite of the fact that reasonable care was taken. Now say for example, there is a group of friends and they go out to hunt in a forest area. Okay, so when you're in the forest, you're ultimately looking for prey. Prey is an animal that you would like to kill. Now if you feel that there is some kind of movement or presence behind bushes, and you confuse that movement to be that of an animal, and you shoot in that direction, ultimately it turns out that it was actually a human being and not an animal. Now this is a case of inevitable accident. Okay, you may have taken the required care and caution that can be taken in a forest, and this was something that was completely unforeseen, to find a human being behind bushes in a thick forest area. Alright, unexpected injury. What is the defendant supposed to prove? Defendant is the person who is trying to take the defense. So under torts there are two parties, plaintiff and a defendant. He has to prove that he had no control over the event. The consequent effect was unavoidable despite reasonable care. I'd like to quote another example. Let's say for example, you're driving well within your speed limit, and with your seatbelt on, with a valid driver's license, you're not drunk, or you're completely in your senses, and suddenly somebody tries to cross the road. It could be a small child. So in your effort to save that child from an injury, you suddenly turn the car, and the car ends up banging into a car which was parked on the right side. Now this is an inevitable accident. This was a situation that you could not have foreseen, right? And you took all the reasonable care, but in that situation it comes under the category of an unexpected injury that you could neither have foreseen. That means you could neither have predicted that accident, nor could you have avoided that accident. Any queries up until this point? Okay guys, I'm going to be proceeding further with law of torts in my next e-lecture, which is tomorrow in the same time slot. So I'm going to see all of you tomorrow at 5:30, and we'll discuss torts till about 7 o'clock. So keep your queries related to law of torts and contract ready if there are any by tomorrow. For today, thanks a lot for your time and attention. Tomorrow the agenda for e-lecture is going to be that we'll wind up the remaining defenses under law of torts. We'll also be discussing the various kind of torts that can be committed against a person or his property. For today, thanks a lot for your time and attention. I'll be seeing you soon.